this is an opportunity for us to hear the reflections from reporters doing the religion beat, and I think to ask questions of them, because you've all been sitting a lot, and I think we might need to ask some questions and keep us lively because it's getting to that time of the afternoon. I'm going to sit on this side of the stage. I've got ear problems. If I fall over, it's not part of the act, all right? Someone come and pick me up. But I'm sure that the panellists will keep going, whatever. So first of all, Kaya Burgess from The Times. Can you come and join me? Burhan Vazi from Hyphen online. Do sit wherever you like, yes. Madeleine Davies from The Church Times. And Justin Cohen from The Jewish News, and Amardeep Bassey from just about everywhere. So I'm going to sort of ask all of our panellists a question or two, and then I will keep asking questions. But once I've gone through everybody, once, just put your hand up if you want to ask a question, and if you want to ask it to everybody, then I'll choose who you ask it to. And if you want to ask it to one person, then just say who that is. But I'm going to start with you, Kaya, religion reporter, correspondent for The Times. You are also the science correspondent for The Times. And I want you to tell me what a lovely brief that is, but why religion is the favourite bit.
Yeah, it's fantastic being both science and religion reporter at The Times, because it's always the first thing people notice at the bottom of my email signature where they say science and religion. It didn't come about because The Times has suddenly decided that it's going to sort of merge these two thousands-of-year-old magisteria into one, particularly. But I had been reporting on religion for a few years for The Times when we decided to expand our science patch. The pandemic particularly had led to that much more interest in the science behind all sorts of things to do with the pandemic and outside of that. But I made the argument that I could continue reporting on religion as well, and that actually they do go together quite well sometimes. Most of my articles will either say science reporter or religious affairs correspondent, but I do manage to get both the titles on the occasional
I saw a Kabbalistic obsession with numbers recently in some of your science tweeting about how many seconds, if you take the universe as a 24-hour clock, how many seconds it is since the Religion Media Centre arrived on the scene, longer than you think. But looking at the stories that you've done over the last couple of weeks or so, there's more science than religion in there. So do you have any difficulties fighting for your religion corner?
That can happen sometimes because it's not always, the amount of politics that there is particularly will always be dominating.
Politics in the newsroom or politics out there?
No, politics in broader society. There's always sort of stories coming out of Westminster, clear that you've got to fight with. The difference between the two patches is that science, every day there are dozens of science journals publishing studies, and so there's this constant flow of things that you've got to sift through to decide what to report on. Whereas with religion, there are reports that get issued occasionally that you are obviously covering on those days, but a lot more of it comes from going out and talking to people, meeting people, interviewing them, and you have more of your own sort of schedule for finding stories rather than the sort of the daily flow.
I noticed you've been writing about the situation with Soul Survivor Church recently. How easy has it been to get into that story?
Well, that's an example, and it's an important story that's been, I've been covering different variations on for years, as we all have on the religions patch, where there was the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. Individual different religious institutions have had their own reports. And so sometimes with those stories, there's a degree to which, almost readers are almost a little fatigued over just how many stories there are emerging over either accusations and allegations of abuse or allegations were mishandled by senior leaders. So you do have to kind of really look at each one individually to find out why is this story different? Why is this story important? And the Soul Survivor story, which I know Gabby from the Telegraph is here as well, she's been covering really well, has been, figuring out why these sorts of allegations had been floating around for a very, very long time, but it's only now 20 odd years later that they're properly being investigated, and that's often the story that's sort of behind just the allegations themselves.
Burhan, you moved from working on Nationals, Al Jazeera, The Observer, many other outlets, to a sort of bespoke outlet, really, for UK and European Muslims. It's called Hyphen Online. I don't know if everybody's heard of it, but perhaps you could tell us a little bit about it, first of all, and then tell us why you made that move and the thinking behind moving from a sort of national outlet to something a bit more niche?
Sure. So we're a small team of 12 journalists based in central London and elsewhere. We cover predominantly Muslim news across Europe, including the UK. But it's everything from how Muslims in different parts of the UK and Europe are being affected by the cost of living crisis in myriad different ways, to how kind of technology is changing how people practice their faith, to stories about difficulties with, like, extended families and elder care, the million Syrians, for example, who were led into Germany in 2015, some of whom are now starting to run for local politics or national politics. So what I'm usually trying to try and impress upon people is that it's a kind of 360-degree view of what Muslim life in Europe looks like.
And the impetus for setting that up, was that because your people were telling you, we don't see ourselves reflected in mainstream media, we need to hear more stories from our community? Was it because you hope through Hyphen Online to sort of push through for other journalists to pick up your stories and so report them more in the mainstream?
I think it's a little bit of both. So where we can, we try and co-publish with much larger partners. We poll a couple of times a year in the UK on kind of Muslim issues. We've just wrapped up a big project on Gen Z Muslims up and down the country. I think we polled about 1,500 of them, But I think, personally speaking and speaking for some of my colleagues, there was this awareness that these Muslim communities, not just in the UK, but in Europe, are increasingly complicated, increasingly younger, increasingly diverse, no longer kind of homogenous, and that the kind of all the shades of how these people live and how they practice their faith and their kind of daily decisions was not really being accurately reflected in the media in general.
Just tell us a little bit about that Gen Z survey.
So we polled over 1,500 Muslims up and down the country, plus a similar cohort of non-Muslims between the ages of 18 to 24, and particularly kind of looking at their access to social mobility, their feelings about, will they, like other Gen Zs, will they ever be able to, do they think they'll ever be able to afford to buy a house? Are they so fed up with the politics of this country that they might want to go and live abroad and get a job elsewhere? Muslims and non-Muslims very much in agreement on that. They would like to go and live abroad for a variety of reasons, including the cost of living crisis. But then one of the things that kind of made the survey kind of stand out was that in the midst of this cost of living crisis, Muslim Gen Zs are more than their non-Muslim counterparts are having to donate, having to give money to their parents to help the family through the cost of living crisis. And this might have something to do with kind of intergenerational housing. Also the fact that, there was I think the ONS figures earlier on this year showed that something like 40% of all UK Muslims live in like 30% of the UK's poorest areas. So I think there's all these kind of tensions that we were able to show with some of that polling. And
that survey did get picked up, didn't it, quite widely?
Yeah, I think that was picked up by the Independent and the BBC and a bunch of other, I think that's really what we try and do as often as we can, which is, we're always looking for kind of unique research.
So Madeleine Davies, you work for the Church Times. You're serving a very particular audience, sort of Church of England mainly. I don't think it's too unkind to say it's a rather different demographic from the one that Burhan is serving. So what are the joys and challenges of serving your particular audience?
I think one of the joys is that I think many kind of national headlines about the Church of England can be quite negative, and I completely agree. It's important to cover it sort of very objectively, and there are sort of important stories to be told, but they're often around kind of decline, aging, can it survive? And I guess part of my one of my joys is that you get to interview people in the Church of England who are doing amazing things as clergy in small parishes, which, nobody's ever heard of, or young people, churchgoers, and the sort of lives that they lead. And I think it's really nice to be able to show that it's kind of still a living faith, that it still kind of shapes people's lives in a really positive way and has a wider impact on British society.
And is that a message you need to give to your audience? Because I would have thought that they were already fairly convinced of that. I mean, I know they fight like cats in a sack, but I mean, they do sort of tend to believe in their own importance, don't they?
Yeah, they do. I think, that's a really good point, that it's a very divided church, and that's kind of probably been a bit of a baptism of fire for me. Kind of when I joined the Church Times, I was very much not familiar with the different traditions, the different wings, and all the kind of politicking and the institutional stuff. So, I hope what we try and do is kind of hold a space where those different traditions and those different points of views can be sort of given a fair hearing, and to try and present something objective which gives the different wings a voice. But you're right about the cats in the sack.
How do you keep a perspective on this? Because one could sort of think, it's a. I mean, I know it. I'm in the goldfish bowl a lot of the time. I mean, how do you keep your perspective as a reporter? What do you read? What do you think is really important to keep track of, so that it doesn't just sort of suck you down?
I think a lot of my friends and family aren't Christians, aren't churchgoers. That very much keeps your feet on the ground. They often won't be aware of religion stories. And at the same time, I think Rowan Williams said that there's sometimes a perception that religion is a sort of quite harmless but eccentric hobby that people have. And I think I kind of want to counter that idea that it's this sort of slightly embarrassing hobby that people have. It's actually goes to the core of your being. It's your deepest held beliefs. For many people, it shapes their whole life, their principles, their values. And so I want the Church Times to be a place where we explore that, where it's not just about, the politics. It's about how people's faith and their spirituality shapes their lives.
Thank you. Justin, you're editor of the Jewish News, which is not the oldest, I'm told, but it is the most read Jewish newspaper, is it not?
You swallowed that propaganda. Yes, no, it's true. I was just wondering if we're going to have a show of hands for which of the Abrahamic faiths is the most fight in a sack at the end, because I reckon we can make a claim to that.
Yes, well, you can fight that out. You can fight that out. We'll put you in a sack if you want. But what do you seek to give? You've got a wide readership. I don't know what your circulation figures are, but your audience is quite wide. There'll be lots of political views represented. What, beyond sort of news from Jewish communities, what are you able to give your readers that they won't get from a national broadsheet?
So I think one of the reasons that I personally have been at the paper as long as I have, about 22 years since work experience, and have enjoyed it very much and tried to reinvent the role, is the ability for a free community, local, hyper-local newspaper to reach into different areas. So, we will run the hard-hitting stuff. We will seek to get the big interviews first. But at the same time, one of our raison d'etre is very much to celebrate and to highlight the positivity within the community. And there's a great deal of that. I wouldn't necessarily expect a national newspaper to be running with those headlines on a weekly basis.
Right, but you've done a lot of reporting on Israel, for instance. I mean, what will your readers get reading that reporting that they won't get from the nationals? Or maybe it's the same, I don't know.
Hopefully an element of depth and detail to start off with. The recent coverage around the far-right elements within the Israeli government is something that we've been focusing on quite heavily since November, since even before this government came to power. And I think we felt we wanted to do that partly because we felt we were reflecting a majority opinion within the community, whatever that actually means. But also that in the same way as we would fight tooth and nail when to expose anti-Semitism, expose other forms of hatred, the fact that there were members of potentially of the new Israeli government that were expressing Islamophobic and homophobic views, albeit in the past, but still there and not really disowned, was something that we should equally fight for.
Thank you. I suppose that it sort of begs the question about when we're talking about reporting religion, about what definition of religion that we're working with, overlaps between community, culture, and so on. So, Kaya, when you're looking for a religion story, what are you looking for? And before you tell me, any questions now, just put your hands up. All right, just 1 minute.
Well, the point there is made perfectly. I mean, obviously, the Times is for a general readership, so I'm not writing to a particular faith group. Our readers will be of all faiths and none. And so I'm not generally necessarily looking for sort of religion stories, as it were, but looking for just interesting news stories that they might be a sort of what you might class as a social affairs story to do with charity work. It might be slightly more political, if it's an archbishop or a bishop intervening in a political question in the House of Lords. It could be sometimes it's when the World Cup is on, and various institutions have got different approaches to how they're going to embrace England having a World Cup match while they would usually be holding a service. Or it can be kind of on any kind of topic that can be related broadly to the fact that it's a kind of a community, that it might be Christian, it might be different denominations, but it might be Jewish, it might be Muslim, but it's not usually a story about religion itself. It's for a kind of general readership.
I wonder, Amardeep, about that distinction between, when is a religion story, when is it a culture story, when does it go to the religion correspondent, when does it go to one of the other correspondents?
Social affairs correspondents.
Social affairs in particular, I guess. Yeah.
The line is getting quite blurred as far as what constitutes, what is a religion. Are we talking only about organised religions? Are we only talking about the big six, so to speak? And certainly I sort of fell into religious reporting by reporting on communities. I had no real interest in their religions at first. Obviously, I identified that these are Muslims, these are Sikhs. But the more I reported amongst these communities, and just to let you know, I report mainly out of Birmingham, one of the most multicultural cities in Europe. I think something like 180 different nationalities called Birmingham home. And so I had to find out about the different faiths and the different religions. And what I particularly found, and I think is something that I will find myself reporting on more and more, are these kind of inter-religious fractures. We saw some of it in events in Leicester a few months ago with, ostensibly a cricket match causing problems between the Muslim and Hindu communities. But certainly in Birmingham, there are no homogenous Muslim community or Sikh community. There are minorities within minorities who never get their stories told. And so, I made it my business to find out what are all these different strands of Islam, of Sikhism, of Hinduism. Where do they clash at times? And you can almost, in every sort of major conurbation, certainly in the West Midlands, practically every week there is some kind of ethnic tension fracture going on.
And is it sometimes important to say, look, religion's not really part of this story? You think it is because we've got, we're talking about a Muslim group and a Hindu group, but actually, religion isn't the issue here.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, often when we're talking about religion, when it comes to social affairs, you're talking about communities who live in inner city areas where economic marginalisation, social isolation, things like that are much more in play than any kind of inter-racism that goes on between them. I've recently just finished a podcast series for Radio 4 about events that happened in Lozells in 2005, where there was tension between the black and Pakistani community over an unfounded rumour that a black girl had been gang raped. And again, there was all kinds of religious connotations about that as well. Social affairs brings you into religion.
Thank you. A couple of questions. We've got a few. So if we have this gentleman here first.
I would like to know when you reporters are going to stop causing the pro-Palestine and anti-Israel protests, because it's not helping peace with Israel. And when the fighting starts with Iran, how are you going to handle the reporting with that?
One for you, Justin.
Yeah, I think that might be aimed at us. We feel that quite apart from anything else, whatever your position is on Israel, Israel isn't served by pretending that everything in the current government or everything in the current country is perfect. It isn't, any more than everything in this country is perfect, or anything in America is perfect, or anything in Australia, I suspect, is perfect. And I think by accepting that and allowing a debate in our pages, I believe that ought to strengthen Israel. Israel can take care of itself. Israel's a pretty strong democracy, it can withstand some criticism. And I think I fundamentally disagree with anyone who thinks that we're provoking anti-Semitism. That's my honest feeling.
Hi, Ben Cohen. I work for Open Doors now, but I'm a has-been religious reporter. I used to work on the local radio and then on the World Service on a program called Reporting Religion. And I was just interested, I don't know how many of you were there, but Daisy this morning was talking about how we should be knocking down the silos. And this may be out of date, but my first thing was, well, actually, careful you do that, because in religion, sort of religious producers, religious journalists have religious literacy, and then they go, well, that's a big story, let's give it to the news. And they do, as I think you said, this idea, it's a bit quaint, it doesn't matter if we get the names of religious leaders a bit wrong or mistake different sort of wings of Anglicanism or Islam or whatever. What do we need to teach religious literacy if we're going to knock down silos to all the people that think it's a sort of a bit of a funny anachronism?
I definitely take that point. I remember, I think the women bishops legislation was about to go through, and I watched the BBC religion guy that had covered, the entire process. And then for the big, vote, it was handed over, to a bigger name, and it was a bit heartbreaking. I think there sort of needs to be some generosity from more religious specialists towards people who are covering things for the first time and don't have that literacy. So I do think there's kind of an education element, but I wouldn't want to be kind of saying, I can't believe they don't know what the correct title for an archdeacon is, because we've all been there that when we started out, and I'd hope there would be a kind of a grace and a generosity in that process of correction and education, because I think sometimes, you have religion appears in a soap or in a documentary, and people will very quickly go on their keyboards and say, he would never wear a chasuble for that occasion, or why is the collar under the, and I feel for the person thinking, gosh, if we're going to sort of be witnesses to our faith, we need to be a bit more generous in the correction.
It's kind of a bit of a question about what religious literacy is anyway, isn't it? Whether it's knowing what you refer to an archdeacon as, or whether it's a sort of more a sort of critical empathy. But I suppose, Kaya, perhaps behind the question as well is that, we live in a world where for some people, religion is a sort of general thing that they sort of see, that they swim in the world around them is religious in places and not. And then for other people, it's very important and very particular. And you have to serve both. So how do you do that?
Well, it's a really interesting question over why, for example, in Britain we love our institutions, and so in a lot of cases, religion reporting, almost too many cases sometimes, will be about the institutions. It'll be about the Church of England, it'll be about the Catholic Church, it'll be about the cats in the sack. But because we love our stories, whether it's about the government, it's about private schools, it's about the courts, it's about the Church of England. We love those stories about a big institution and what's kind of going on within it. And something like the Church of England, which has been a completely central part of British and English society for centuries, means that people are fascinated by it without necessarily needing to be of faith themselves. I think the challenge for religion reporters can sometimes be trying to move away from the big institution stories when, for example, if you're talking about Islam and different mosques across the country and you don't have that same kind of hierarchical structure and press offices and archbishops to answer for everything, then you have to work harder as a reporter to then actually be talking to people within communities about stories that are interesting to them.
Burhan, can you respond to that? Because it's as a general religion reporter, sort of trying to get into some of the sort of non-established communities can feel quite hard to a reporter. How do you make your inroads, and how can you encourage and help other journalists do that?
I think, frankly, it's a bit of a challenge for us sometimes as well, especially when you're looking at kind of increasingly diverse Muslim communities, and especially when you're looking at issues where there might not be a kind of consensus. A story that we covered recently was how artificial intelligence is changing Friday prayers for small groups of Muslims around the country.
How is it changing Friday prayers?
Younger imams, mainly younger imams, are now using artificial intelligence to write the Friday sermon, and this is there are a couple of things going on. One is that like it's an incredible labor-saving device. It's also increasingly quite accurate. A couple of the imams that we interviewed told us that they felt the AI had written a better sermon than they could have, and there's not really any kind of like general consensus about this, right? Like if you call a couple of the larger Muslim organizations who represent huge numbers of mosques, they have not really come to a consensus as to whether the use of AI is a good or bad thing. Now, to me, that almost is like the perfect religious story.
And scientific story, there's one.
Yeah. So this is almost like the perfect religious story, because here you have like a small group of Muslims within a larger group of Muslims wrestling or embracing with this new technology, which is ultimately going to have a huge impact, not just on Muslims in the UK, but people from all other faiths.
I would just add that one of the most fascinating stories in any religion can often be, and the thing I think people who have no religion are most interested in, is how different religions are trying not to stay relevant, although that's a question, but just grappling with kind of modernity generally in the same way that we all are. So I mean, I did a story a little while ago about how finding out what the exact time that qualifies as dawn for the first prayers of the day was proving kind of tricky. And these astronomers had worked with mosques in Birmingham actually to use astronomy cameras to detect the first light of dawn to help provide a more consistent time. And those sorts of stories are really fascinating, and it's a religion story because it's a group of mosques who are trying to do it, but it's also just the same story that we've all got of how can we use modern technology in our daily lives to kind of solve those problems or those challenges, which happen to be religious ones in this case, but it's a kind of quite a universal story that is interesting to anyone.
So another question.
Hello, I'm Ros Mayfield, was at the BBC, now at Premier. We talked in an earlier session today about the entwining of nationalism and religion in a couple of countries, the US and in India, we mentioned it as well. And we also said, though, that the way that faith is portrayed in those scenarios is not always representative of everyone in that faith. And I want to ask, how do people of faith who feel that those leaders don't represent them get representation and prevent their religion being hijacked? And how do you see your role in helping them with that dilemma?
Who would you like to ask that question of? Because I'm just going to take one answer from this panel.
Maddie. I don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a statistic that was always bandied about around Donald Trump about, I think, over 80% of evangelicals supporting him, but they didn't break that down into race. So that was actually white evangelicals. And I think, there was a whole slightly untold story probably about black evangelicals and the way that they were voting and about other Christian denominations in the country. So around the time that was happening, I interviewed an author who had tracked down Trump voters, but actually dug down into why they were voting for him, what their motivation was. And I also covered hopefully a slightly broader story about how there were other evangelicals who really spoke out against Trump right from the start, and particularly in the black community. And I think sort of that was something that got very much kind of glossed over because it was such a powerful statistic, and it was an important statistic. I mean, he did really ride the wave to power on the back of evangelicalism. But as you say, within that, there was a lot of complexity and some untold stories, I think.
Thank you. One more question. Andrew Greystone.
Thanks, Andrew Greystone. I've spent half my life in news and production rooms and the other half in religious communities. And I'm interested in what reporting religion does for your soul. Let me put it this way. If you were stranded on a desert island, would you rather be stuck with a group of journalists or a group of religious leaders?
Who would you like to ask that of?
Well, a brief answer from everybody would be lovely.
Go on, briefly, Kaya.
Well, that's a great question, because when journalists get together, I imagine, like anyone else in the same industry, they just all endlessly moan at each other about, their own news editors, which could both be reassuring and deeply tedious, I imagine. So
I don't think I'd want to be stuck on a desert island with a group of journalists at any time.
You wouldn't?
No. What
about religious leaders? Any better?
Might be equally complicated.
Madeleine?
I think there is a serious point under there in that it does have an impact. And if you actually bring your faith to work and then you're constantly writing about an institution where there is abuse, which you've championed, there's corruption, there's division, it really does corrode you. So I think you do have to have links outside your job where your own faith and your own spirituality gets looked after. Having said that, I probably would still choose religious people, kind of all religions, because I think I would probably want people to pray with how to get off.
Justin?
I've always felt that the fact that I have been able to establish a specialism around this area was something that I really enjoyed about the job. The fact that also a lot of the stuff that we're writing about has a relevance, a connection in some way to family, to friends at any one time. It's often the subject that is dominating my Facebook feed or whatever else that younger people use these days. I felt that kind of connection was kind of fundamental to my connection to my job. In terms of spending time on a desert island, I think you could do worse probably than spend time with either the current chief rabbi or with his predecessor, to be honest. So it wouldn't be bad at all.
I can definitely say I would choose the religious leaders over journalists. Journalists will just be talking about their stories and how they managed to get one over a religious leader, probably. So I'd rather hear it from the religious leader. As regards my own faith and journalism, I know it might sound a bit corny, but as a Sikh, I wouldn't say quite a practicing Sikh, but a nearly there Sikh, my religion, says that you should be always rooting and working for the downtrodden, those that don't have a voice, those that are the weakest, the selfless service type concept, which is very much Sikhi. So in that respect, it is very much a driving force for me in that I want to find those extremely marginalised, within marginalised communities who, some of the most satisfying moments I've had in journalism is just seeing the reaction of a community who have never seen their community's name in print before. And it wasn't even a great story. It was just a mundane story about something they did. But the fact that, this is in a British newspaper, is being sent out, to all parts of the globe. So that's where, forget the big stories and the breaking news and whatnot.
Thank
that's
you.
Where the real satisfaction.
We've got very little time left, but I'm going to stay with you, Amardeep, and I'm going to run along the line. And I want you to think of a working day or a moment or a story that you worked on that either made you excited or happy or so outraged you had to go and do something about it. So if you could all just choose one story, and it can be as big or little a story as you like. I'm going to start with you, Amardeep.
Happy is probably not the right description, but certainly excited would be 9/11, the day of 9/11. As a young journalist from Birmingham, again, I was a bit naive in those days, not had the world experiences I've had since then. For me, purely as a fast-moving event, something that's momentous, and something that was going to bring Islam, I felt, to the fore for the next few years. Once people want to know about Islam, they're going to want to know about other Southeast Asian religions as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Justin?
Two things, if I may. The first one was the thing that one of the things I'm most proud of was actually working with Michael and Alex over there, Rabbi Alex, on a list of young people under the age of 40 who are leading the way in interfaith cooperation in the UK. Worked with Church Times and British Muslim TV before Burhan was on the scene in this way. And that was the result of quite a long hunt for the right partners and working out the right way of doing it. I think that was the first collaboration of its sort in the world. The thing that really got the journalistic juices going, I guess, was being asked after 3 years of trying to come the following morning to the leader of the opposition's office to interview Jeremy Corbyn, his first interview with the Jewish media since taking office, and with years and years of questions lined up and saved, I realised that I had to kind of narrow that down and got to his office. I realised, though, that we weren't, this wasn't an interview that I could really win at. I had parts of the Jewish community that probably would have wanted me to literally physically assault him. I got the impression. And then you had other parts from the journalistic sector who also were looking at this interview, looking at seeing what he would say. And I just felt I couldn't really win. But yeah, that was probably the most satisfying and exciting period.
Madeleine.
Something that made me really happy recently, and I don't like retweeting praise because it makes me cringe a bit, but I got a really nice comment on a feature that I wrote on autistic people in church. And this autistic guy said it had made him feel like holding hands with other autistic people in the church. And I think that's just the nicest feedback that I've ever got on an article. And I was very nervous about publishing it because I was so conscious that I could get the language wrong. I could fail to, interview enough people, enough kind of diverse experiences. So it was just like a feeling of relief that it worked for somebody. So, yeah.
Burhan?
I think something that I'll probably always remember is coming into the office when I worked at the Times on the morning of the London bombings. So, I mean, most people won't remember, but this is pre-Uber, this is pre-mobile phones with apps. I think I got off the tube at like Baker Street. I found a black cab. I remember the news was coming on the radio at that point, about 9 a.m., 10 a.m., what had happened across London. I offered a couple of people near me a lift if they wanted a lift over to where the Times used to be in Perrington Street. One of them worked in the city. He decided to jump in the back of a cab. The other person was on her way to a classical music recital, an audition. So she jumped in the back of a cab with her cello. And this is a city that I'd already lived in for about 15 years. I'm from Glasgow originally, but London is very much home. I couldn't believe that this had happened to London, and I think, as we got kind of closer and closer to the centre of town, my two new friends, co-passengers, decided they didn't want to come into central London, that they were scared, and they decided to get out the taxi. And I was one of a handful of people who managed to make it into the office and was immediately asked to go out and report on the tragedies, And I think that's something that really stays with you when it's your city, it's a city that you see as home, and suddenly you're kind of covering it in the aftermath of this horrendous news.
Kaya?
On the sort of religion front, in December, I traveled to Ukraine with the Archbishop of Canterbury, and it was quite a secret trip in that it hadn't been announced beforehand. And it was sort of taking sleeper trains because you couldn't fly in a sleeper train from Warsaw. And it felt like I think a privilege is the best word, because it was sort of seeing what was going on inside, seeing, you're so used in this country to tales of Blitz spirit from sort of my grandparents' generation and thinking of it as this very 1940s thing, but seeing people in a 21st century capital living through that kind of warfare was quite something, and seeing the bomb damaged areas around Kyiv. But talking about religion, it was interesting that we don't think of the Russia and Ukraine situation as being a religious conflict, and yet the elements that exist of there being two Orthodox churches in Ukraine, one historically linked to Moscow, one not. The Archbishop of Canterbury had meetings with leaders of both, also Catholic churches, Jewish leaders as well, and hearing the way that they were trying to help their communities in a way that was sort of irrelevant to religion, and yet it was a really good example of religious leaders on the ground just getting on with helping people kind of regardless. And then in terms of the dual science and religion patch, one of my favorite stories to work on was I'm really fascinated by what's now called astrobiology, which is essentially astronomers looking for signs of life either still living or extinct, possibly on other worlds, rovers on Mars and probes to Jupiter's moons and telescopes looking at distant solar systems. But it turned out that NASA had given a $1 million grant to a theological college in the United States, asking them to recruit theologians, including some Church of England priests, to answer the question of how would the world's major religions react if NASA said, guess what, we've discovered that life evolved elsewhere. Would they just have to sort of write, well, that's it, we're tearing Genesis up now and throwing that out the window? Or would they kind of react in quite a sort of sanguine way? And most people said, well, actually, all these great scientific discoveries over millennia, churches have kind of adapted to. I learned a lot about, there's a quote in the Quran about how Allah supposedly scattered life throughout the heavens, and so sounds like they got there first on discovering life elsewhere. Theologians saying if God can create life on earth, then surely he can create life anywhere. I was like, well, that's a very kind of handy way of thinking about it. So that was an absolutely fascinating chance to put science reporter and religious affairs correspondent on an article.
Lovely, thank you ever so much. Do thank my panel for giving up their time. Very generous of you all.